Okay, picking up with where we left off, whenever that was, a week ago today, I believe. This is chapter 19 in Prisoner of Azkaban. And picking up the last few pages of it. I want to start on 374. So the scene is, you have Harry, Ron, and Hermione. They're in the room in the Shrieking Shack. Sirius and Lupin are there, and they've made Peter Pettigrew transform from his Scabbers rat form back to human form. And Pettigrew is essentially begging Harry and Sirius not to kill him and such. And Pettigrew says to Harry, top of 374, Harry, James wouldn't have wanted me killed. James would have understood. He would have shown me mercy. Okay. And Sirius says, you sold James and Lily to Voldemort. Do you deny it? What could I have done? The Dark Lord, you have no idea. He has weapons you can't imagine. I was scared, Sirius. I was never brave like you and Remus and James. I never meant it to happen. And Sirius points out, that's a lie. He'd been passing information on to Voldemort for a year before Lily and James died. Okay. A year before Lily and James died was, if we take kind of the timeline back, just about the time Harry was born, which in terms of this novel, this is the third year. Okay. So Harry is now 11, 12, 13. So it's back to essentially, 13 years prior to this novel. Okay. Pettigrew says, what was there to be gained by refusing that? And notice, Sirius does something that we've seen Harry do before, and that we've seen Dumbledore do, and that we've seen Dobby do. He listens to the question and he rephrases it and interprets it. What was there to be gained by fighting the most evil wizard who has ever existed? Notice what he adds. Peter said, what was there to be gained by refusing him? That is, what was in it for me if I refused Voldemort? Look at now how Sirius rephrases that. What was there to be gained by fighting the most evil wizard who has ever existed? Notice the way Sirius rephrases it, it becomes a rhetorical question. Right? What is there to be gained by resisting the most evil, let's put it in our terms, the most evil person who's ever existed? Why is that a rhetorical question? What does it mean? It means you should, obviously, okay, fight against evil. But notice the response that he gives to his own question. Only innocent lives, Peter. So if you take a stand against, the most evil person there is, Sirius's comment is, what is there to be gained? Possibly people who might otherwise die will live, or people who would otherwise die might live. You don't understand. He would have killed me. Okay? So Peter reduces it to, it's either me or them. Right? Go back, and I never thought about this till just now. Go back to the end of the first book. Dumbledore's talking to Harry about the philosopher stuff and how it gives people, two things. And he says, the thing is, humans have a knack for choosing the things that are the worst for them. And he mentions the two things most people would want: unlimited wealth and immortality. And that's when he says the trouble is people have a knack for choosing the two things that are worse for them. Notice what Sirius says, excuse me, what Peter says here, he's choosing my life over what? Those, possible innocent lives that Sirius mentioned, okay? Kind of interesting because we're going to hear innocent lives brought up again in book 5. Dumbledore is going to talk about innocent lives, that people that might have died because he kept a secret from Harry that he's going to suggest he should not have kept. So he would have killed me, Sirius. And Sirius says, then you should have died. Notice what he's suggesting. Death isn't the worst thing that can happen. You should have died. Died rather than betray your friends, as we would have done for you. We would have rather died, he says, rather than betrayed you to Voldemort. Now, when he says rather than betray your friends, I think ostensibly he's talking there about James and Lily, but he's got to also be talking about himself, right? Because, what did Peter do a year after Voldemort's disappearance? He set up Sirius Black. He killed all the Muggles. He disappeared, blasted a piece of his finger off, and sets up Sirius as the fall guy. Lupin, you should have realized if Voldemort didn't kill you, we would, okay? Doesn't Lupin's comment kind of, in a bit, undercut some of what Sirius is saying? I mean, it seems to me that it does, but Lupin's not, trying to think how to put this. Voldemort would have killed Peter Pettigrew without any cause, without any, quote unquote, justifiable reason. Lupin is suggesting we have justifiable reason. It's not revenge. It's not vengeance. It's more of you broke a trust. Okay? So Harry says no. And we're told he places himself in front of Pettigrew facing the wand. You can't kill him. Sirius and Lupin, Sirius and Remus are both, surprised at that. And Harry says, we'll take him up to the castle. We'll hand him over to the Dementors. He can go to Azkaban. Don't kill him. Peter, thanks Harry for his mercy and such. Harry says, I'm not doing this for you. I'm doing it because I don't reckon my dad would have wanted them to become killers just for you. And Sirius said, you're right, Harry. You're the only one who has the right to decide. But think about what he did. Harry, he can go to Azkaban. He deserves it. What's Harry also thinking? Well, what's at Azkaban? Dementors. Might Harry be suggesting Peter Pettigrew deserves the Dementor's kiss? Because earlier he told Lupin that Sirius Black deserved it, and Lupin kind of, was surprised and said, really? Do you really think anybody does? Okay. So we see the chapter, The Dementor's Kiss. Harry rescues them, all right? Well, not yet. Chapter 21, Hermione's Secret. We see Snape explaining to Fudge what's going on, and Harry and Hermione try to explain to Dumbledore, bottom of 392, 393. Dumbledore says to Harry, listen, Harry, it's too late. You understand? You must see that Professor Snape's version of events is far more convincing than yours. Notice, Snape's version of events. He doesn't say Snape's account or Snape's history or Snape's facts. It's Snape's storytelling is what? More convincing. It's more persuasive, right? And he and Hermione, excuse me, he and Hermione say, top of 393, but you believe us, Dumbledore? Yes, I do. But I have no power to make other men see the truth. Right? So he's saying, you and Hermione are speaking the truth, but I can't make others what? See that. Why not? I mean, Dumbledore is the most powerful wizard. Some people say, whoever lived, why can't he? So Harry, 393, top of the page, had expected Dumbledore to pull some amazing solution out of the air, like, rabbit out of the hat, magic, in other words. But there wasn't it. So Dumbledore says, we need more time. And he kind of explained, Hermione gets what he talks about. Dumbledore tells her, Hermione explains to Harry what the time turner is, how she got it from McGonagall. She says on 395. Okay? And they've got to go back 3 turns. Dumbledore says, maybe more than one life can be saved tonight. And he's giving Hermione the clue there about Buckbeak. So they go down to Hagrid's cabin and to 406, 407, they talk about the Dementors. Harry says, I saw my father. She said, Harry, your father's dead, etc., etc. And that's how Harry then knows, page 411, what it was he saw. He actually saw himself conjuring the Patronus. Right? And we'll go on to Owl Post again. Snape is beside himself with anger that Harry's getting away with something else. And 423. Lupin is saying goodbye, and he explains why he has to say goodbye. 423, this time tomorrow, the owls will start arriving from parents. They will not want a werewolf teaching their children. And after last night, I see their point. That is, after last night when Lupin turned into a werewolf again, right? And he mentions, that Snape accidentally let slip that Lupin's a werewolf, which is entirely why he had the students write the 2-scroll essay on werewolves. Let's see. He gives Harry back the Marauders map because he says, since I'm no longer your teacher. 425. Harry has his annual debriefing with Dumbledore. Bottom of the page, Dumbledore asks, why so miserable, Harry? You should be very proud of yourself after last night. Harry, it didn't make any difference. Pettigrew got away. Now, what does Harry really mean? I mean, Pettigrew got away. That's kind of a distilled form of a more complete answer. What's he mean? Pettigrew got away, so he can't be charged. He can't be brought to trial. He can't give evidence or proof that Sirius is innocent. So Sirius is still assumed to be guilty. Sirius is still on the run. He's still a criminal. He's still an escaped convict, all those kinds of things. What else? Well, Harry knows Sirius was his godfather. And What did Sirius offer Harry as they were making their way back up to the castle before Lupin, escaped and such? He offered Harry the chance to come live with them. Okay? Be away from the Dursleys forever. And it was that thought that enabled Harry to conjure the Patronus. Right? So Dumbledore says, didn't make any difference. Harry, you helped uncover the truth. You saved an innocent man from a terrible fate. Right? It's Dumbledore asserting, one, Sirius is innocent, and two, what was his terrible fate going to be? The Dementor's kiss. Right? But he also says you helped uncover the truth. But who knows about it? Harry, Hermione, Dumbledore, Sirius, Ron, Snape. Okay. And by mentioning the word terrible fate, bottom of 425, something clicks in Harry's mind and he thinks of Trelawney's prediction and he mentions it. And he kind of recounts what it said and he asks Dumbledore, do you think that was real? And he says, Harry, I think it might have been. I think that brings your total number of real predictions up to 2. So Harry says, then I stopped Sirius and Lupin from killing Pettigrew. That makes it my fault if Voldemort comes back. Notice the kind of logical argument he's making. You can start over here. Lupin and Black were going to kill Pettigrew. Harry stopped Lupin and Black from killing Pettigrew. What's the point that Harry doesn't state? And he jumps to the conclusion. The conclusion, Voldemort comes back. Harry takes, I stopped Lupin and Black from killing Pettigrew. Therefore, it's my fault if Voldemort comes back. Right? He's leaving out. Pettigrew has what? He's got a choice. He has free will. He can choose whether to help Voldemort or not. That's why Harry says, it's my fault if Voldemort comes back. Dumbledore, it does not. That is, you're wrong, Harry. Your logic is faulty. Hasn't your experience with the Time Turner taught you anything? The consequences of our actions are always so complicated, so diverse, that predicting the future is very difficult business indeed. Professor Trelawney, bless her, is living proof of that. You did a very noble thing in saving Pettigrew's life. It's kind of interesting. Dumbledore makes that statement. Consequences of our actions are so complicated, so diverse, predicting the future is very difficult business indeed. Because if he were to apply it to his own life and events that happened years and years and years before, he wouldn't make some of the claims possibly, I think, that let me rephrase this. He wouldn't imply some things that he implies in books 5 and 6 and even part of book 7. Okay? You did a noble thing. But if he helps Voldemort back to power, Dumbledore, top of 427, Pettigrew owes his life to you. Okay? You have sent Voldemort a deputy who is in your debt. When one wizard saves another wizard's life, it creates a certain bond between them. Why does Snape hate James Potter? Because James Potter saved Snape's life. There's that bond. And I'm much mistaken if Voldemort wants his servant in the debt of Harry Potter. Harry, I don't want a connection with Pettigrew. He betrayed my parents. This is magic at its deepest, its most impenetrable, Harry. In other words, this is Dumbledore saying, this is a Department of Mysteries kind of magic. Trust me, the time may come when you will be very glad you saved Pettigrew's life. And when I said, it's a Department of Mysteries kind of magic, I think this is the kind of magic that is kept behind a perpetually locked door into the Department of Mysteries. It's why Harry frequently comes to other people's aid. It's the idea of love. Okay. The time may come when you will be very glad you saved Pettigrew's life. Notice, Harry can't imagine when that would be. And Dumbledore says, your father would have saved Pettigrew too. Okay. He wouldn't have let the others kill him. And that's when Harry says, I thought it was my dad who conjured the Patronus. I thought I was seeing him. Dumbledore, easy mistake to make. You do look a lot like your father, except for your eyes. You have your mother's eyes. Harry, I mean, it was stupid. He's dead. You think the dead we loved ever truly leave us? You think we don't recall them more clearly than ever in times of great trouble? No. This is J.K. Rowling talking to herself. Here's my little bit of psychoanalysis. This is J.K. Rowling bolstering her inner, recharging her battery, so to speak, over the death of her mother at a young age when she was 22. When Rowling was 22, her mom was 45, I think. She's still wrestling with that. Your father is alive in you, Harry. He shows himself more plainly when you have need of him. Okay? Your father reveals himself in you. How else could you produce that particular Patronus? Prongs rode again last night. Notice Dumbledore seems to be saying the reason Harry's Patronus is a stag is because his father is somehow, and I don't mean this literally, is living in Harry. Or is it because of who Harry is and who his arch enemy is? Right? After all, what is the Harry's Patronus is a stag. Okay, his wand is made out of holly and phoenix feather. Holly is what? It's an evergreen plant, tree, can be tree, depending on how it's pruned and stuff. Has thorns, and during the winter it has red berries. Okay, its leaves are kind of crown shaped, and they've got spikes on them. If this were a whiteboard, each little point there would be a thorn. Okay, so it's kind of like thorns in a circle, and it produces red berries during the winter. Okay, there's a Christmas carol called "The Holly and the Ivy," Holly, holly and the ivy, that is full of symbolism. Well, the holly is symbolic of Christ. It's evergreen. It's never dying. Okay, it's got each leaf kind of has a crown of thorns, and it produces red berries during the dead of winter. And the red berries are symbolic of blood. Okay, life kind of giving blood. So Harry's wand is made out of that and phoenix feather. Phoenix, death, and rebirth. It's the whole rebirth, resurrection imagery. What's Voldemort's wand? U, Y-E-W, and also phoenix feather. Why? Because Voldemort thinks he's going to figure out a way to beat death. Okay? But interestingly, there's only one animal that will eat yew leaves. They're needles, actually. It's it's not an evergreen tree. Okay. Anybody know what it is? Stag. It's a stag. Right. There's also, in the Christian tradition, there's a tradition of stags stomping on adders, poisonous snakes, you know, and there's a kind of a allusion to biblical imagery, prophecy there, you know, it shall bite your heel and you shall crush its head. The snake shall bite the heel of Christ, and Christ will crush its head, will defeat Satan and such. Well, that's tied up with Harry and Voldemort and such. Okay. So Dumbledore goes on and talks about how, you know, Sirius told him about how they became animagi, and Dumbledore said, you know, amazing, since they kept it quiet from me and such. Let's see, skip a little bit more. Go to the end, and how does it end? It ends with Harry getting not a literal Hogsmeade permission slip signed, but a form signed by Sirius as Harry's godfather, saying he has permission to go to Hogsmeade. And Harry uses that form because Vernon asks about it to tell Vernon that he has a godfather, he's an escaped convict, he's wanted for murder, and he's going to be checking in on them. So from the end of that school year to the beginning of the previous school year, what does Harry have to worry about? From the Dursleys? Pretty much nothing. Once Uncle Vernon knows that Harry's mass murdering godfather is keeping an eye on him, he pretty much leaves him alone. Okay. Go on to Goblet of Fire for a few minutes. So we have 27 minutes left. So how does Goblet of Fire begin differently than the first three books? They all begin, books 1 through 3, at number 4, Privet Drive, right? Goblet of Fire does it. It breaks the formula. See, after the first three books were published, people started to say things like, oh, she's just writing what's called formulaic fiction, like romance novels and the Harlequin kind of romance series. Pretty much, if you read one, you've read them all because they follow the set formula, right? Well, Rowling changes all that with this book. And in, you know, book 5, she goes back to it. We start at number 4, Privet Drive. Book 6, we've moved. Yeah, book 6, we start with the other minister. Book 7, we start somewhere else entirely. Okay, so she's kind of indicating this is not just, you know, this set formula that I'm following. The first 3 books are essentially mysteries. They're whodunits. Right? First one, we have to figure out who done it in terms of who stole the Philosopher's Stone. Second book, what is the Chamber of Secrets and why is it important? The third book, who's the prisoner of Azkaban and blah, blah, blah. Fourth book, we find out the Goblet of Fire stuff early on. We don't find out who put Harry's name in early on, but we find out what it is pretty early on. Fifth book, a bit different. We don't know what the Order of the Phoenix is until very late, though there is an allusion to it in Goblet. So, number 4 begins at the Riddle House. And we see, first time in the books, we see a murder. We see Frank Bryce get killed by Lord Voldemort. We don't know how Lord Voldemort can hold a wand. He's got some kind of baby-like form. Okay. But we see Frank Bryce get killed, and we hear a little bit about Frank Bryce's history. And Harry wakes up next chapter with his scar hurt. And he thinks, okay, so what do I do about my scar hurting? And he thinks of people he can write to and how those people respond. And so ultimately he decides to write to Sirius. Okay, so he sends his letter off to Sirius. We get the invitation from the Weasleys, which I'm going to skip just about all of. Chapter Back to the Burrow. Weasley show up via flu powder to pick up Harry. Unbeknownst to them, the fireplace has been closed off, sealed off with a wall and such. So Mr. Weasley has to blast a hole in the Dursley's wall. And Fred and Ron and George get all Harry stuff. And they all go back through using flu powder, and page 48. Harry's getting ready to leave. And Harry says to the Dursleys, well, bye then. They didn't say anything. Harry moves towards the fire, and Mr. Dursley reaches out behind Harry and, puts his hand on his shoulder. Harry said goodbye to you. Didn't you hear him? Harry, it doesn't matter. Honestly, I don't care. Mr. Weasley keeps his hand on Harry's shoulder. You aren't going to see your neighbor till next summer, he said to Uncle Vernon in mild indignation. Surely you're going to say goodbye. Uncle Vernon's face worked furiously. The idea of being taught consideration by a man who had just blasted away half his living room wall seemed to be causing him intense suffering. What does that mean? What does that mean to be taught consideration? See, we don't use this word consideration the way Rowling uses it here very often anymore. We use the word more or the phrase to be considerate of. That means to take into account another person's thoughts, feelings, emotions, etc. What Uncle Vernon's having trouble with is, here's this guy, this wizard, who's teaching him what's meant by consideration. Manners. Who's teaching him manners. When this guy's just blown up the wall of his living room and there's dust scattered everywhere. See, he's got a hard time, wrestling with. How do you think you can teach me manners when, with what you've done? Okay. And so Vernon says, goodbye then, Harry, see you. And, Fred and George's tongue coffee, comes into play. Dudley eats it, his tongue swells up 4 feet. Mr. Weasley fixes it, he fixes the wall, he goes back to the burrow. Okay. Fred and George get upset. Harry sees Percy. Percy's, Mr. Crouch this, Mr. Crouch that, etc., etc. Chapter 6, the port key. They use the port key to go off to, find the port key to go off to the Quidditch World Cup. And they run into the Diggories, pages 72 and 73. And we see Amos Diggory recognize Harry and say, Harry Potter? Yeah. Ced's talked about you, of course. Told us all about playing against you last year. I said to him, said that'll be something to tell your grandchildren, that will. You beat Harry Potter. Fred and George are not quite happy with this. Cedric says Harry fell off his broom, Dad. I told you, it was an accident. Now, notice, Harry fell off his broom, Dad. He doesn't say Harry was attacked by a bunch of Dementors. Because as far as we know, Cedric doesn't know that. Nobody else knows that, except for maybe Ron, Hermione. Lupin obviously knew it, Dumbledore knew it and such. So Amos says, Yeah, but you didn't fall off, did you, son? Notice, what is Amos showing us here? I mean, obviously, family pride. His son beat Harry Potter. Okay. What else is it, though? It's a bit of vicarious living, how he's living through his son. Who is Cedric Diggory in the grand scheme of things? He's a nobody. Okay. This is his 15 minutes claim to fame, so to speak. Always modest, are said, always the gentleman, but the best man won. Notice, by the way, modest and a gentleman. What are the hallmarks of Hufflepuff? Just, loyal, fair, hardworking. Okay. Cedric pretty much is a good Hufflepuff. Best man won. I'm sure Harry'd say the same, wouldn't you? Hey, one falls off his broom, one stays on. Don't need to be a genius to tell who's the better flyer. Now, stop right there and jump to the first task. Skip the Quidditch World Cup, Dark Mark, the whole 9 yards. First task. And what do we hear Ludo Bagman say about Harry? Great Scott, he can fly. And then he says, are you seeing this, Mr. Crumb? Notice he doesn't say, great Scott, he can fly. Are you seeing this, Mr. Diggory, talking about Cedric? No, he equates Harry's flying with Victor Crumb's flying. Victor flies for the Bulgarian national team. Cedric? No. And who's the one saying that? Ludo Bagman, a formerly famous player for the English national team. Okay. And he's talking about Harry's ability. So, you got to imagine, I think that when Amos says this, obviously he's clueless about how Harry really can fly, because we saw in almost the opening of the first book, Harry's first flying lesson, how well can he fly? He realizes he's a natural. He gets on a broom and it's like he automatically knows what to do. So they go off to the Quidditch World Cup. Bagman and Crouch, the next chapter. We meet up with the Malfoys. And Harry meets Winky, sitting up there, top of the, stands and such, saving a seat for Mr. Crouch. Doesn't know why. Winky tells Harry about Dobby, page 98 following, how Dobby is, not doing well, rising above his station and such. And we're going to skip the actual Quidditch World Cup because it's not really important. And we get the Dark Mark. All right. Page 119 and following. So we see a group of wizards. It's nighttime. They've all got masks on, or like sheets pulled over their head is more of how they're described. Heads are hooded, their faces masked. Okay. And they're pointing their wands up in the air, and there's 4 people suspended in the air above them. Others are running to join the group. And as they march around, they're running over tents and all kinds of stuff. And Harry, Ron, and Hermione run into Malfoy. Right? He says they're going after mudbloods. So you're in danger, Hermione. Right? We go into the clearing. Page 129. Notice they hear a voice, say Mordra, 128. They see the Dark Mark. Harry doesn't know necessarily what it is. Hermione explains very quickly, whose sign. And then Harry hears, or they all hear the almost like popcorn popping. And Harry sees all the wizards forming a circle around them with their wands pointing at them. And he says, duck, and pulls Hermione and Ron down. Why? This is just Rowling reinforcing for us Harry's what do I want? His savior quality, his guardian quality. You know, he could just fall to the ground and let Ron and Hermione fend for themselves, but he doesn't. He pulls them down. And we get the questioning about the dark mark. We discover Winky. We hear, you know, Amos Diggory 132 and following kind of suggest maybe Winky learned it from his master, and Barty Crouch Sr. says, you know, maybe he's suggesting that I teach my house elves the dark mark and other, you know, dark magic and such. And they make their way back to the Weasley's campsite. Okay. After Mr. Crouch, page 138, suggests he's going to dismiss Winky. Hermione gets upset. Mr. Weasley says Pottermore 141 when Ron asks, what's the dark mark? Mr. Weasley says it hasn't been seen for 13 years. Okay, so this is book 4. 13 years would mean when Harry was a baby, when Harry was a year old. We know it was seen above Harry's parents' house. It's referenced, okay? And that was when Voldemort was last seen, okay? So 142. Ron says, I don't get it. It's just a mark in the sky. Big deal. Mr. Weasley. Ron, you know who and his followers sent the dark mark, this is 142, sent the dark mark into the air whenever they killed the Terrans. You have no idea. You're too young. Okay. He doesn't mean you're too young to comprehend. You're too young to understand. He means you're too young. It hasn't been seen in your lifetime. Well, let me rephrase that. It hasn't been seen in your lifetime that you would remember, right? Because Ron would have been a year old. Later, we're going to hear you're too young to mean you're not old enough to comprehend or understand. And we're going to hear Ron and Hermione and Harry all say, you know, try us, why don't you? Maybe we're not as young as you think we are, okay? So he says, Mr. Weasley, to kind of help them understand, just picture coming home and finding the dark mark covering over your house and knowing what you're about to find inside. Why? Where was it used before? Whenever someone was killed. So you see that mark. What does that mean? Somebody's been killed in the house where that mark is hovering over. You know, what would its equivalent, not literally, but kind of be today? Be similar to a swastika. The only difference would be swastikas were put on flags and stuff, and swastikas weren't only used when people were killed. But imagine if they were. Imagine if you only saw a swastika when somebody died, so that if you saw a swastika painted, spray painted on the side of a synagogue, then what does that imply? There's going to be a dead person inside the synagogue and such, okay? So he goes on, explains about Death Eaters, and Harry asks, top of 143, what were you know whose supporters up to? Levitating muggles. I mean, what was the point? All right. That is, Harry saw the Robertses being levitated, and he wants to know, what's he mean by the point? What's the purpose? What's the goal here? What does it achieve? What does it do? Mr. Weasley, the point? Harry, that's their idea of fun. Half the Muggle killings back when you know who was in power were done for fun. Okay. That is, there wasn't any point. And keep in mind, what's that telling us about Voldemort and his supporters? They're not terrorists in the traditional sense of terrorist. See, a terrorist is one who uses death, bombings, things like that, for what purpose? It's to inspire terror. So that's the point, to inspire terror, to make one afraid, okay? And as much as we might say, the terrorists will never win, the terrorists have already won. I mean, going all the way back to 2001. Look at how life has changed since 2001. Every time you get on a plane, the terrorists have already won. You got to take off your shoes, you got to take off your belt, you got to pull your computers. You didn't have to do that prior to 2001. I remember flying many times where, you bring a full-size bottle, it's not showing up, full-size bottle of water, bringing matches, bringing lighters, you could bring, knives that are, where's my fingers, that are 8 inches long on the planes. All of that has changed. So the terrorists have, in many ways, they really did win. So he says, I suppose they had a few drinks tonight, couldn't resist reminding us that lots of them are still at large. That is, okay, so if there was a point, it was to say, we're not all gone. Right, okay, but if they were the Death Eaters, why did they disapparate when they saw the dark? I mean, if that's their calling card, why weren't they happy? Use your brains, Ron, says Bill. If they really were Death Eaters, they worked hard to keep out of Azkaban. They'd be even more frightened than the rest of us to see him, Voldemort, come back. Why? Because if he came back, he would know they betrayed him to keep from going to Azkaban. They denied they'd ever been involved with him when he lost his powers. Went back to their daily lives. I don't reckon he'd be overpleased with them. Do you? Hermione, so whoever did it, we're doing it to show support for the Death Eaters or to scare them away? Notice Hermione's trying to think logically about this. So they're kind of giving him a shot in the arm or trying to make them leave. Mr. Weasley, no idea. But only the Death Eaters knew how to conjure it. I'd be very surprised if the person who did it hadn't been a Death Eater once, even if they're not now. Okay. Chapter 10, Mayhem at the Ministry. What is the mayhem? It's the ministries trying to handle the fallout of what happened at the Quidditch World Cup. Okay. What does that really mean? It's the ministry trying to control the press, trying to control how people view and understand what is happening. And you get an awful lot about Rita Skeeter. Okay. And, Mr. Weasley answered some questions, and Percy says, Dad should have checked with his head of department before he said anything, blah, 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 blah. Okay. Harry mentions his scar hurting, tells him what he saw in his dream, that it wasn't just a dream. Let's see here. Page 151, we get reference to Mrs. Weasley's, 6.5 minutes, to Mrs. Weasley's grandfather clock. It had 9 golden hands. Each of them was engraved with one of the Weasley family's names, right? You have Arthur and Molly Weasley, the parents, and then the children. Charlie, Bill, may not have that in correct order, Percy, Fred and George, Ron, Ginny. Charlie, Percy, Fred, George, Ron, Ginny. I'm missing one. There's 7 children. Okay. And on each of the hands or around the face, there aren't numbers, but home, school, work, etc. Okay. 8 of the hands were currently pointing to the home because 8 of the people are at home. Okay. But Mr. Weasley's, which was the longest, was still pointing to work. And Mrs. Weasley says, your father has had to go into the office on weekends since the days of you know who. And Rowling is preparing us for things are going to be like they were in the past. Okay? Percy goes on and makes a comment about how father screwed up, and Mrs. Weasley, shuts him down. Okay, so who am I missing? You got Arthur, Molly, Charlie, Bill, Percy. That's 5. Fred, George, Ron, Ginny. That's 9. Okay. I don't know why I didn't have them counted right over there. So they get their stuff from school. Ron gets dress robes. And let's see here. Aboard the Hogwarts Express, we find out Mad-Eye Moody is going to be at Hogwarts this year. He's an old friend of Mr. Weasley. It's 161. Charlie says, met him once when Dad took me into work with him. He was an Auror, one of the best, dark wizard catcher. Half the cells in Azkaban are full because of him. Made himself loads of enemies, though. Let's see here. They get on the Hogwarts Express, and Harry, Ron, and Hermione overhear Malfoy. Malfoy says 165. Father actually considered sending me to Durmstrang rather than Hogwarts, He knows the headmaster, you see. Well, his opinion of Dumbledore. The man's such a mudblood lover. And Durmstrang doesn't admit that sort of riffraff. But Mother didn't like the idea of me going to school so far away. Father says Durmstrang takes a far more sensible line than Hogwarts about the dark arts. Durmstrang students actually learn them. Okay? So Hermione has to teach Harry and Ron about other wizarding schools. And Malfoy alludes to the Triwizard Tournament, but doesn't actually say anything about it. And I think we'll stop there. So on Friday, whether we're in class or I do another video lecture, we will pick up with the Triwizard Tournament and try to go, we'll get to at least halfway through the book because I want to have a quiz. It's at 7:33. Second.